wanted this origin piece in this video about speculative theories related to the Emperor, primarily because of the age of this lore explanation, and the fact that one of my core principles for what can and can't be trusted hasn't happened when it comes to this detail in the lore, the 40k human history. And what that is that, as far as I can tell, this theory about the shaman's soul blending has not been really restated nor referenced significantly since. Which for me doesn't dismiss it completely, but it's a red flag that it might not be trustworthy anymore. Does that even matter today because I'm just talking about whatever the hell we want? No. Additionally though, the Emperor has been described by even fellow perpetuals as the strongest among them, meaning he is a perpetual also, or they believe that he is. The perpetuals, from what we can largely discern, are not created, they just appear through natural human production, like Erda and Ol P. So their assertion that the Emperor is a perpetual, it kind of conflicts with this concept of him being forged by suicidal shamans. So what is it? Do they just not know? Or another of the Emperor's lies? He just noticed that there were others like him and were not dying over the millennia, and he said, oh, I'll just go with those guys. Worth noting though that perhaps being a perpetual is not necessarily defined by how you came to be one. For example, Vulcan, Primarch of the Salamanders, is a perpetual, but he wasn't born through a natural process of just humans. Basically, he wasn't naturally created as a perpetual. He was artificially genetically forged, as were all the Primarchs. But of course it's said that the Emperor based him using some of his own DNA, partially at least, and there are some instances also where people are able to be kind of given immortality for a period of time and then have it taken away. But the construction of Vulcan may explain why Vulcan got very lucky in being the Captain Scarlet of the Primarchs, one man fate deemed indestructible. Convenient. When the Golden Throne was first activated, we knew that it took immense psychic power to be able to control it. So much so that it would later destroy Malcador, and in its earliest phase it only required 1,000 psychers to power it. But as the Sister of Silence who was managing that engagement of those initial pods observed, she tried not to think about the fact that for every pod containing a psyker being loaded into the Golden Throne chamber from below that first time, there were 9 other pods for each bay empty, meaning its total capacity was presumably around 10,000 psychers. We don't know exactly how many psychers are used to power the throne in M41, it may vary even day to day, but as per the 6th edition reference, it's certainly at least 4 or 5 times that original number. It's been speculated that this was to be the role of Magnus, Primarch of the Thousand Suns. I say speculated because, again, as often, it was Chaos who really showed us that possibility, so it's anybody's guess really. But it does seem pretty likely, knowing the Emperor, and that Malcador and the Emperor have expressed disappointment in Magnus, Malcador especially, and that the Emperor would have, without a spare thought, probably have used Magnus as something like a gigantic battery, or depending on how optimistic you want to be, maybe something like a coordinator of the Astronomicon, able to reach out and communicate and administrate galactic travel and communication networks. Ambitious but seemingly feasible concept, but something which would have trapped and tied Magnus here forever. So it's kind of comical and ironic that of course the Emperor ended up trapped there instead. It should be noted, just for clarity, that the Astronomicon and the Golden Throne are very separate constructions in different places. The Golden Throne is buried deep, very deep, under the Emperor's Imperial Palace on Holy Terra, surrounded by thousands of chambers needed to sacrifice psychers to the Emperor on a daily basis. The Astronomicon has a similar construction with its psyker chambers wrapping around it, again supposedly requiring 10,000 there, also located under where the Emperor's vast development of technological research and development was built, along with the vaults, armories, etc., under the peaks of what were the ancient past known as the Himalaya. So both are well protected, underground, but separate, and the two devices are linked by immense power conduits as seen from the Imperial Palace. Something though that has always troubled me is how easily dismissed it is that the Emperor is being continually fed so many human psychers. It's just accepted as a basic fact. They're not war casualties though, they're not soldiers drafted to defend their homeland on the borders of an imperial system based on ideological principles. The psychers sacrificed to the Emperor are usually just rounded up like animals, terrified men, women, very often children, dragged through a hellish cold journey in space to Terra, some of whom might lose their minds in the process, which is irrelevant really, and then methodically put to death, murdered, if you will, to allow the Emperor another day of existence. And whilst that is important, you really start getting into ethical and philosophical discussion points there. It's actually one of the more disturbing aspects of 40k, and there are many. It's been elaborated on plenty, but this came from the Emperor's orders. It's clear that this was his plan, and it must have been his plan for some time because they had to think about this and construct the Golden Throne apparatus. It's such a troubling concept, it even made Custodes and other Sisters of Silence question what it meant for themselves and the future of humanity and the Imperium. The fact that these figures of such impeccable moral character and service to the Imperium would question the Emperor's actions should really give us massive pause for thought. Yet it's mostly entirely dismissed by us, the audience of 40k. This, among many other things, contributes to why I still have serious issues when it comes to just what the Emperor is and what his true intentions are, no matter how much rhetoric he puts out there. Because everywhere you look within the lore of 40k, everywhere you see anybody who glimpses below the veil of what the Emperor wants you to see, comes away extremely disturbed and questioning just what they thought. Korax, Guilliman, Erda, of course Alania's person. Malcador even throws in some seemingly more blunt descriptions from time to time. The point being, the Emperor always appears with this warm, genteel, benevolent, soothing facade, his actions shrouded by philosophical and often deliberately confusing speeches which are meaningless to the people he's talking to. He's often kind of conversing with himself. This is why it's so absurd as well that the Emperor chose himself to be this immense golden superhuman, so beautiful that it literally appears to stun ordinary humans like a rabbit in the headlights. But when it's stripped away, what hides beneath seems to be truly terrifying, a ruthless being with seemingly singular goals in mind, determined to enact them by any cost, any means necessary. Those early moral boundaries and promises of a new bright future for mankind collapsed almost before they had begun. Everywhere you look to someone who is genuinely close to the actions and methods of the Emperor, and not just those who would see him as a mythical godlike figure that must be obeyed and worshipped without question, seems to significantly ask themselves, is this okay? Because what we're doing here seems deeply, deeply wrong on every level. Everybody that's involved in something that's going on with the Emperor seems to have this perception, this feeling in them that it's not right. We can get into that specifically a bit more when we eventually do part 5 of the Emperor series, but things like the raising of Monarchia, Lorgar, shorts like The Board is Set, First Lord of the Imperium play heavily into questioning these very serious prospects that the Emperor deliberately and intentionally orchestrated the Horus Heresy, which is mind-blowingly disturbing. If we roll all the way back to the very first time the torturous apparatus of the Golden Throne was switched on, it makes for a truly chilling vision. Whenever we say psychers fed to the Emperor, it is anonymous and ambiguous, but as we considered already, it's a terrifying, unpleasant thing. As one of the Custodes observed after it had been used for the first time in Master of Mankind, the Sisters of Silence had enacted their secretive, unspoken sanction. They fed the throne with the lives of 1,000 psychers. In every pod, he could see a corpse thrashed in its death throes, raking uselessly against the transparent panels. All of them were dead, every one of them, and none of them looked to have died swiftly and painlessly. It was also noted by Kyria, one of the Silent Sisters, who was deeply troubled by this, when her superior tries to set her straight by observing, "We're not the engineers of the Imperium's change, sister. We merely react to it. The Imperium changed when Horus set his blinded eyes upon a throne he does not deserve. We do nothing but the Emperor's bidding. This is his will. This is what must be done." 1,000 souls, Kyria? Is that really so many? Is that such a sacrifice, weighed against the consequences of doing nothing? But Kyria notes that 1,000 innocents, nervously awaiting the soul binding they were falsely promised, 1,000 men, women and children believing they now go to serve their Emperor. As her superior is reminding the sister of her duty and role and the critical importance of what they're doing in the wider scheme of things, the horrifying realization of the sister is that 1,000 souls, what do the calculations state? How long will they last? And the Mistress of the Black Fleet lifts her hood back into place, covering her silver hair, and she says they will burn for 1 day. She signs to her. The sister Kyria thinks to herself, what of tomorrow? 1,000 souls today? And she has of course realised this unbearable reality, that these 1,000 innocents are merely one single day. From here on, it's an unrelenting, torturous slaughter of humans. So this to me has often raised the question. Nobody actually knows how the Golden Throne works. in terms of exactly what it's doing. We know what it's supposed to do, but only the Emperor knows this, seemingly. He says as much when speaking with his custodes. In fact, the Emperor even somewhat alludes that he isn't entirely sure if he made it himself. He seems though to be in something of a lucid state, as he is through much of Master of Mankind. When discussing the throne device, he speaks to it as if it's some culmination of human knowledge, and that he somewhat can't take all the praise for its achievement, but of course that only with him could it have been possible at all, of course. So we're led to believe that this process fuels the Emperor now. The throne secures the doomed portal as well of the webway, and the Astronomicon is similarly powered by human sacrifice. Most people assumed for the longest time that the Golden Throne was keeping the Emperor alive, but again, nobody ever really knows that. But instead we learned not so long ago the Emperor exists in a perpetual, see what I did there, state of life and death. He's continually dying and being reborn, trapped in an unreleased way. Remembering there are those in the Inquisition who consider that his soul needs to be poured into a new, appropriately pure vessel. It was Dan Abnett who was the one to reveal this potential cycle for the Emperor. It is though not at all clear if this was the Emperor's intention to exist in this state for so long, or if he's become inadvertently trapped, that what he really needs to be is not continually powered by psychodeaths, but to allow himself to be fully reborn, instead of dying and being injected with psychic energy on a daily basis. But if that were true, then why construct that entire system in the first place, and why set those orders from day one? He must have had some idea, or again, maybe he didn't have an idea, and as seems sometimes to be the case, he was just kind of winging it, didn't anticipate how things were going to play out. In truth, as Dan explained, the concept of the throne chamber on Terra is something of a mythical thing itself, and one perhaps imagines something more akin to the underground frozen storage facility in Akira, with masses of cables obscuring whatever remains of the Emperor deep inside. The terminology of the corpse Emperor on the throne, who knows if his body truly even exists anymore? Whatever he once was has been twisted and whittled down to a husk of his former self. When Robert Gulliman went to see him, who knows how he actually sort of interacted there? Maybe it was merely a psychic projection. We know that the Emperor can do that. Like the shamans though, was this perhaps the Emperor's goal all along, to instead harvest millions, likely now billions of souls into his body, so that he may indeed become, not unlike those in the warp, a new god? Even Malkador has made veiled references to this indispensability of the Emperor at times, and at one point said, quote, "But will he be around forever?" That is the great question, that is the current test, says Malkador, seemingly to become entirely consumed and distracted from his conversation with this huge consideration about, will the Emperor be here forever? Does Malkador know something we don't, in terms of the true goal? And if the Emperor is a perpetual, why is he questioning that? He also seemed to suggest that without the Emperor, everything fails. Humanity needs the Emperor to rule them forever, like a god. The Emperor has now achieved this status of a god among nearly all of humanity for all intents and purposes, and if you join the dots, it's somehow difficult to not consider this was an intention for him, that maybe we as humble fleshbags are incapable of truly comprehending just how vast and complex his plan was from the start. Then again, maybe we're just thinking far, far too hard about someone with ambitions above their ability, and the Emperor simply made a string of catastrophic mistakes. What tends to undermine the thinking along the lines of a convoluted grand plan is that there are several occasions, most notably perhaps in Master of Mankind, as it's one of the most clear accounts of the Emperor engaging and discussing with others about himself, and as a narrative it's also one of the most misquoted I think out there of the entire Heresy series. I've literally lost count of the number of times people have at me about something from Master of Mankind and then gone to check it to discover it was entirely misquoted or just plain wrong. But regardless, the Emperor does, particularly in this story, have a habit of conversing with people around him, telling them things which objectively gain him nothing, other than to present his case as that of a person or figure who is not fully in control and merely attempting to follow his best laid plans, and as and when forced to, react to situations. Despite his foresight, it would seem, he was unable to foresee some critical pathways, which again leads us into other discussion points about the functionality of time and the warp yet again. Often the Emperor seems to actually suggest that people don't have the ability to make decisions. He seems to suggest that decisions are already made and you are just acting this out. He even says so to Malkador, which again comes back to my idea that 40k exists as the eternalist point of view when it comes to time. A counterpoint could be that when you are a thing as complex as the Emperor, it's believable that he would present his manner and approach at all times regardless of whether he was truly sincere or not. Much like a method actor, I suppose. So I don't think the Emperor appearing concerned at how all was not going to plan is necessarily indicative that this wasn't part of his plan, you might say. But it suddenly adds a single weight on the side of the scale that says maybe he didn't actually have an extremely convoluted, vast, grand master plan, but maybe some details we have seen were elements of a broader attempt to hedge bets. But once you start thinking like that, it's where you really start going down into a rabbit hole of what ifs. So, moving on. Now, next is something that I have noted before, but very, very far back on the channel, almost at the beginning of the 40k videos in fact. I always disliked this shaman explanation, but I do admit it has more weight in the actual lore than this concept of the Emperor maybe being not a literal old one, but perhaps some kind of seed laid down by them. Now, as I always say, it's important to be clear about evidence, and this one is very, very much just my own speculative headcanon. I like to imagine it's possible at least that some rogue old one, perhaps who was involved in the creation of a race such as the Eldar, had been living on a planet alone to escape the horrors of the war in heaven, and after a significant amount of time, decided that it needed to do one last thing to attempt to lay revenge upon both the Necron and the Eldar, for that matter, for not preventing their destruction. So I imagine this old one dabbled in the earliest awakenings of what would become mankind, perhaps that Neolithic time where the Emperor and Old P may have appeared from. The old ones had seeded Earth itself long before, and so it has some idea already about how to manipulate us. After all, much like the Eldar, humanity is, for reasons that are not explained, moving toward a position of becoming psychic beings. And it was the Emperor's belief, as among perpetuals, that humanity will continue toward this trend of psychic evolution, maybe humanity emerging as a psychic race, and that this even was part of our original evolution, but maybe the emergence of perpetuals was due to interference from old ones. Why would I make this assumption at all? Well, it's worth to remember that the old ones are very adept at seemingly creating species that are very persistent and hard to permanently exterminate. The purpose for this was, of course, to give something capable of fighting against the Necron tier, who themselves had found a way to become functionally immortal, remembering that the Necron tier's original goal had been to gain that knowledge of how to be immortal from the old ones. So is it such a leap that the old ones wanted to just use that knowledge in the end by implanting it into humanity? So when you consider the Eldar as well, during their ancient history they were able to reincarnate from the warp endlessly, and coupled with their psychic powers, too difficult an enemy to overcome for the Necron tier, the Necron. Orcs as well, not as refined as the Eldar, but also believed to be a seeded life form of the old ones, regenerating insanely fast, incredibly persistent, and have powerful psychic ability generated by themselves, not requiring the warp as the Eldar do. So is it really that big of a jump when you look at the characteristics of humanity to consider there are some shared traits here? A powerful intelligence that gave us the abilities that made us strong enough at one point and position in time to make humanity the most powerful race in the galaxy during the Zenith, a slow development of psychic ability, and among some, this emergence of both perpetuals and nulls. The old ones seem to have had a hand in seemingly most life in the galaxy, but it is of course so far back in history that it's little more than remnants, dust of mythology. No one can know just how involved they were in anything, but given that fact itself, it's worth surely at least to be an option open to consider the possibility that the old ones were somehow involved in humanity's development to a degree, and with that perhaps a lone surviving old one toiled away in caves upon old Earth, forging the most powerful humanoid life form or version of life forms in perpetuals that it could fathom to make before it disappeared somehow forever. Then to follow on, I guess a fairly straightforward possibility when it comes to the Emperor, as he himself sometimes appears to believe all perpetuals are something akin to what humanity has the potential to become. Not necessarily the immediate next evolutionary state for humanity, perpetuals seem to be either abstractions, mutations, or perhaps leapfrogs in the advanced states of human form. Psykers now more generally seem to be where humanity is trending toward, although not if the Emperor keeps burning through them. The emergence of Psykers has continued unabated though since the Age of Strife, which is around M25 to M30, although very likely they did exist prior to this but were either not so powerful enough or avoided detection, more likely persecuted by other humans as witches and the like. The Emperor has been described by his fellow perpetuals as the most powerful among us, and the reason I'm mentioning this option is that potentially the Emperor is actually more bland in his origin story. Maybe it's not some grand, convoluted shaman plan or meddling ancient beings. Perhaps it literally was just fate and probability at play. The numbers just aligned, and the Emperor was a being produced by stock humanity. Again, the Emperor somewhat describes this himself as he talks to his past and senses his emerging power. He doesn't speak about how he actually came to be, just speaks about being a boy and sort of feeling his power, knowing that he can control others and basically murders somebody. That though could just be his immense latent power blinding himself from knowing just what he was in the beginning. Or if we're going to get more mysterious, maybe he can't remember. Maybe something happened between him and Malcador. Who knows? What helps support this idea though for me is that figure of Ol P, that Solanius person, who is another perpetual who is supposed to be older and been active among humanity far before the